Lion in the Wind, Chapter 12. Bergen looked up from his work in surprise as Delgra and Mestra walked into the room. "Ah, Major. What brings you here today?" asked Bergen. "Oh, just giving a tour to one of the new guys," said Delgra. "That would be me," said Mestra. "Nice to meet you," said Bergen. "Lieutenant, this is Dr. Bergen. He's one of our top scientists here at the facility, and the creator of the Lion Project," said Delgra. Mestra perked up slightly. "So you're the scientist that created the lions everyone's talking about? Fascinating. What can you tell me about them?" he said, excitement dripping from his voice. Bergen shrugged. "What would you like to know?" Mestra glanced over at one of the unfinished lion bodies. "Oh, anything, really. What can they do? How smart are they? What is their range? Stuff like that." Bergen shrugged. "Well, I can't tell you most of that because it's classified as top secret." "What would I need to have to get that kind of information?" "Clearance level 9 or higher." Mestra frowned. "My clearance is only level 3. So I guess you can't tell me a lot." Bergen shook his head. Mestra shrugged. "Oh well. No big loss. It was just curiosity." Bergen smiled. "Well, don't worry. Someday you'll get a chance to meet Tegani in person and see a working android lion firsthand." Mestra cocked his head in curiosity. "Tegani? I've heard about him. Where is he?" "That's classified, Lieutenant," said Delgra. "Oh, sorry, sir," said Mestra sheepishly. Just then Persia stepped out of the office and walked past Mestra. But as she did, a strange odor made her stop. She then turned and sniffed curiously at Mestra's pants and uniform jacket. Her eyes soon narrowed. Bergen saw her standing behind him and smiled. "Persia! Good morning. How was your nap?" he said. She walked around Mestra suspiciously, and then over to Bergen. He, in turn, squatted down and began to rub her chin and scratch her behind the ears. She relaxed slightly and purred gently, enjoying the attention she was getting. Even so, she continued to keep an eye on Mestra. "Ah, is this your pet tiger? She's cute," said Mestra. Persia glared at him disdainfully. "I am not a pet," she muttered. Mestra blinked in surprise, and then laughed. "You can talk. Is this another of your robots?" he said in surprise. Bergen shook his head and laughed. "She's not a robot. Persia is a snow tiger." Mestra looked at her in confusion. "Then how does she talk?" he asked. Bergen shrugged. "Nobody really knows. She just can." Mestra nodded in approval. "Fascinating." Delgra cleared his throat and said, "Sorry to interrupt your conversation, Doctor, but there's a lot more of the facility I need to show the lieutenant. But I thank you for having us." Bergen nodded, and said, "It was my pleasure." As the two men left the room, Persia watched Mestra suspiciously through narrowed eyes. After the door closed behind them, she turned to Bergen and said, "I don't like that guy. There's something about him that's just not right. And that smell. It just felt wrong somehow." Bergen laughed. "Oh, don't be silly. He's a trusted military officer. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be here." Persia shook her head. "I know, but something about him smelled wrong. But I'm not sure what." Bergen patted her on the head, and said with a smile, "You're imagining things, sweetie. Just because he's new doesn't mean he's suddenly one of the bad guys." Persia gave a frustrated grunt as she sat down for a while to think. Bergen chuckled and then walked back to his office to freshen his cup of catter before continuing his work. Welt crawled over to Tegani and followed the lion's gaze. "What do you see?" he whispered. "Nothing yet. But I can hear movement in the grass." The men turned and drew their rifles to the ready, aiming them at an as yet unseen enemy. "Wait, hold your fire. They're friendly," said Tegani when he finally saw the source of the noise. The men uneasily lowered their rifles, but continued to watch cautiously until a platoon of Yigsin soldiers appeared out of the prairie grass behind them. A young officer approached Welk and said, "I'm Lieutenant Pentel, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd ID." "Sergeant Welk, commander of the 1st Cybernetic Expeditionary Squad," replied Welk. "Oh good, I've got the right unit. Our colonel sent us to give you a hand." "He heard that the general sent you out here all by yourselves," replied Pentel. "Thanks for coming to our aid. I've been feeling like a dead man walking since first hearing about this assignment," quipped Sims. "So, do you have an attack plan yet?" asked Pentel. Welk nodded and quickly explained the plan he had. Pentel cocked an eyebrow in surprise. "That's rather ambitious, isn't it?" he said. "Already told him that myself," said Sims. "Well, with the addition of your platoon, it should be a bit easier," said Welk. "I hope it will." "So what do you want me to do?" asked Pentel. "You're giving me preference of leadership," said Welk in surprise. Pentel shrugged. "Hey, it's your operation. We're just the backup." Welk nodded in understanding. "All right, then why don't you take your men over there and see if you can't knock out their TOC? I'll take my squad back here and we'll go for the communications vehicles," said Welk as he pointed at 2 areas of the Gorg lines. The lieutenant shook his head. "Not without some heavy firepower, you're not. I've got 4 bazooka teams with me. I'll send 2 of them with you, plus some ammo carriers, and a half-dozen riflemen to help you out. That extra firepower should give you a better chance of surviving this mission." Welk nodded. "Thanks. Not a problem. What frequency are you transmitting on?" asked the lieutenant as he tapped his earpiece. 704.1 MHz, replied Welk. The lieutenant adjusted his transmitter, and then tested it. "All right, now we can stay in contact with each other to make this attack work. It's going to be darn near suicide, but if we do it right it should take some of the pressure off those boys on the ridge line." They flinched slightly as a stray shell exploded nearby. "Sounds like we need to get moving," said Sims. "Give us a couple minutes to get into position and we'll signal you when we're ready," said Welk. The lieutenant nodded, divided up his men, and then slipped away as Welk's squad moved forward towards their objective. His men soon encountered a long row of bushes which they used for cover while Welk sized up the situation. After a bit, he turned and gave the order to go, sending both groups through the grass and towards the Gorg lines. Pentel's men were the first to engage the enemy, surprising a small Gorg company that was putting pressure on the Yigsin lines. Initially the Gorg didn't notice the attack. But when they began to lose a lot of men, they stopped, wavered in confusion, retreated, pushed forward again, and then eventually fell into a broken retreat as Pentel's men decimated their ranks. Welk's squad also encountered a Gorg company moving along the left flank, but found it to be under strength and somewhat disoriented. Seeing an opportunity, Welk turned to Tegani, and said, "Ready?" Tegani nudged his partner and then crouched down so the soldier could climb on his back. "Ready," said the corporal. Welk waited for several moments, and then motioned with his hand for them to go. Tegani exploded out of the reed grass like a shot and raced forward at top speed towards a line of vehicles not far away. He paused briefly at the edge of the formation to drop off the soldier before continuing on and plunging into the Gorg lines at great speed. Like a whirlwind of death, he systematically cut down each and every Gorg commander and soldier he could find. None were safe from his fury, regardless if they were a mere buck private or a high-ranking officer. This had the desired effect of throwing the Gorg troops into a state of complete panic and disarray. Taking advantage of this, Welk's squad began cutting down the Gorg infantry in droves as they wandered around aimlessly in search of someone to lead them. Then, as though empowered by an unseen force, several of the Gorg soldiers took charge of the situation and turned the full firepower of their unit against the Yigsin hiding in the nearby reed grass. Welk quickly found his squad pinned down by an incredible hail of fire. Pentel soon encountered much the same thing, leaving both squads in a very dangerous position. Tegani listened intently as both commanders tried to rally their men, not in an effort to stay on mission, but rather merely to survive. Tegani continued to move forward through the Gorg lines, slaughtering as many soldiers as he could find. "Tegani, the communications truck is to your right," shouted his partner over the radio. Tegani turned and spotted the truck just as bullets pinged off his body shell. He turned back to see several soldiers shooting at him as more raced in at him from other directions. He turned to his left and was about to attack several nearby soldiers when he felt the ground suddenly leap up beneath him, followed by a dull thump. His body vibrated violently and then his sensors went dark. He quickly did a self-diagnostic and found everything to be operational except his sensor array, which appeared to be briefly offline due to a sudden impact. The first sense to return was his hearing and then others as the sounds of falling earth and the smell of charred fur and hot metal filled his mind. His vision returned next. He then quickly scanned the area and found himself, much to his surprise, embedded in the hood of a Gorg jeep. He looked back at the driver's seat and noticed that the driver was slumped over the wheel dead. Tegani looked back in the direction he'd come from and spotted a smoldering hole in the ground several feet away. More bullets whizzed by his head. He briefly scanned the area around him and found that he was surrounded. Not knowing the full situation, he dislodged himself from the hood of the truck and then quickly withdrew to the cover of a nearby line of trucks. As soon as he felt safe, he took stock of himself and searched for damage. A section of his skin was burned away and there were several fresh gouges in his body shell. They weren't deep, but it was apparent that he'd taken a significant hit. He did one last check of his body and found several other places that his skin was missing. He knew there was likely more damage than what he could find through this brief examination, but he would have to wait until later to find anything else that might be broken. "Tegani, pull back. We're getting out of here," came Welk's voice over the radio. "I'll be right there," replied Tegani. He then raced back towards his squad members as fast as his feet would carry him. As he ran, he spotted 2 LAVs, and several squads of Gorg moving towards his friends. A rocket whizzed by his head, and sailed off into the distance, exploding harmlessly several hundred yards away. Tegani turned and spotted a group of bazooka men nearby that were taking aim at him. He glanced briefly at the LAVs, the bazooka men, and again at the LAVs. Just then an idea crossed his mind. He knew how to stop the LAVs, but it would require some help. He quickly raced over to where he'd left his partner, only to find him dead. Tegani growled loudly and turned back towards the Gorg pursuing him. One of them then fired a rocket at him, but missed. Tegani immediately turned and raced towards the 2 LAVs bearing down on his friends. Upon arriving, he decimated the small squad of Gorg moving behind them, and then paused to allow the Gorg bazooka men to take aim. Another rocket then flew in his direction. He quickly jumped out of the way, allowing the round to sail past him and into the first LAV, destroying it. He soon did the same with the second. Seeing that his companions were now safe for the moment, he turned again and raced at the Gorg bazooka men who ran away in fear. But they were soon replaced by several jeeps mounted with heavy machine guns. Seeing that his current plan was no longer an option, he broke off pursuit and soon rejoined his squad. Upon arriving he found that 3 of them were dead, and several others wounded. The rest, though, appeared alive, albeit clearly shaken. "Am I glad to see you?" "I thought we'd had it," said a soldier. "You look a little rough around the edges," said Sims. "I've suffered some damage, but I am still fully functional," replied Tegani. Suddenly they heard their radios crackle to life. "Tegani, if you're there, come help us. We're being overrun." Welk looked at Tegani and then motioned to his left. "That's the lieutenant. Go help him. We'll meet you back at the road." "But I've got to get you to safety," said Tegani. "Don't worry about us. We'll get ourselves out of here. Go help the lieutenant." "But, enough people have died already, Tegani. We don't need any more casualties. Now go save them." "That's an order," shouted Welk. Tegani hesitated briefly, and then turned and raced at full speed towards the last known location of the lieutenant's men. As he ran, a Gorg bazooka squad spotted him and opened fire with everything they had. He quickened his pace as one rocket after another exploded around him, sending up great showers of dirt into the air. Some of the explosions were so close that they nearly knocked him off his feet. But he kept running. "Tegani! Where are you?" came Pentel's desperate voice over the radio. "I'm on my way, Lieutenant. Get ready to pull back when I get there," replied Tegani. The lieutenant popped up from his hiding spot and then looked on in horror as he saw the murderous barrage that Tegani was running through. "Covering fire! Get cover on that lion," he shouted. His platoon immediately opened up with all they had at the Gorg bazooka men that were attacking Tegani and cut them down. Tegani soon reached Pentel's men and skid to a stop next to the lieutenant. He quickly assessed the situation, but didn't like what he saw. Of the original men that had come with the lieutenant, 9 were dead, and 4 were wounded, one of which was near death. The lieutenant himself had a slight wound on his right leg and squatted uneasily on it. "We need to get you out of here. Grab your wounded and let's go," said Tegani. "All right, you heard him. Let's get moving," said Pentel. Just then mortar shells began raining down all around them. "Take cover," shouted the lieutenant. Tegani quickly scanned the area, and soon spotted a small team of Gorg operating several small punt mortars nearby. He then contacted a nearby Yigzin artillery unit who immediately silenced them. Seeing that it was now clear, the lieutenant ordered his men to retreat. The squad quickly pulled itself together, picked up their wounded, and then made their way towards friendly lines. But as they did, they found themselves having issues carrying one of the wounded. Tegani hurried over to the men, and said, "Put him on my back." The men quickly complied, and then hurried on ahead as Tegani carried the man as fast as he could through the reed grass. "Leave me," groaned the wounded man. Just then bullets sailed over Tegani's head like swarms of angry hornets. "Don't say that. I'll get you out of here safely," replied Tegani. "No. I'm already gone. Save yourself." "That's not how please. If you die, many more will die because you could not save them," said the man. He coughed briefly, spitting up some blood as he did. "Please. I'm dead already. Leave me and save the others," he groaned. "I cannot do that. I must save you," said Tegani more insistently. "If you can't leave me because I'm wounded, then kill me so that you won't have to." Tegani's eyes went wide. "What?" Another shell exploded nearby, showering them with scorched grass and smoldering black dirt. "Please. You must survive. I can't kill you," shrieked Tegani as he hurried towards cover. "Please. I am just a burden to you." The man's eyes rolled back into his head and then his body went limp. Seeing that the soldier had died, one of the other men stopped Tegani, and said, "He's gone. Drop him and let's get out of here. We'll come back for him later." Tegani stopped and looked back at the advancing Gorg. "Tegani," shouted the soldier. Tegani shook the now dead soldier off his back, turned and hurried through the grass followed by the other soldier. They soon caught up to the rest of the retreating men and met up with Welk, who was helping the lieutenant to safety. Both men smiled as Tegani appeared. "Put him on my back. I'll carry him. We need to move with speed," said Tegani. They helped the lieutenant onto Tegani's back, and then moved quickly towards the Yigzin lines. As they drew closer, a number of Yigzin soldiers moved into position to help cover their retreat until all of the remaining men were safely behind friendly lines. Once on the other side, they continued moving deeper into friendly lines until they were greeted by several medics who quickly took charge of the wounded. Seeing that his men were being taken care of, Welk found a vantage point nearby that allowed him a clear view of the Gorg lines. To his surprise, he found that their attack had worked, as the Gorg now fumbled around in disarray, their lines threatening to collapse at any moment. He soon returned to his men, and was surprised to find Tegani sitting under a nearby tree assessing his body's condition. The look on Tegani's face gave Welk pause for concern. "You all right?" he asked. Tegani shook his head. "I appear to have taken more damage than I had originally thought. My sensor pack and some of my joints need servicing. I also believe there may be a crack in my body shell. These are items of damage that I am unable to repair on my own. I can still fight if I am required to, but my abilities will be greatly reduced until proper repairs can be made. Welk sighed. Well, then I think we need to get you back to see the good doctor. Tegani nodded. Yes, that would be advisable. Dr. Bergen picked up his phone and answered cheerfully. But the smile on his face soon faded to an expression of concern. Oh dear. Is he all right? He replied. Persia rolled over in her bed, stretched and partially opened her eyes. Seeing the look of concern on Bergen's face, she raised her head in curiosity. How bad is it? He asked, nodding several times. Well, yes. Bring him back immediately. I'll take a look at him and see what I can do. Yes, please. Thank you. Goodbye. He hung up the phone and rubbed his chin in concerned thought. Is everything all right? Asked Persia curiously. Tegani's been hurt, said Bergen as he continued to think. Persia stood up like a shot and stared at Bergen in horror. How bad is it? She asked with great concern. Well, he's functional. But from the way the sergeant described his injuries, it sounds like he may have exceeded his limits. It's nothing that'll threaten his life, if that's what you're concerned about. But it has limited some of his mobility. I'm quite interested in seeing the damage he suffered, and hear him explain how he got his injuries. It should help me make improvements to the new body designs before this war gets any worse. If one day of hard fighting has done this to him, we'll need to make him stronger or he won't survive the war. You sure he's all right? Asked Persia with concern. Bergen nodded. He's fine. Sergeant Welk said he had a long talk with Tegani, and his injuries sound more superficial than anything. But he also agreed that it would be best if we checked them out to be sure. He then walked out of his office and into the laboratory with Persia on his heels and studied the alloy formulas for the body shell. He thought about them briefly, and then said to himself, I wonder if I can improve this. Well, I'd better not until I find out how it failed. You said he had other injuries. What were they? Asked Persia, a hint of concern still in her voice. Mostly joint damage from what he said. Also, they mentioned something about a crack in his body shell. Honestly though, it really doesn't surprise me at all that he got hurt. His body was never designed to be used in combat. What amazes me though is how quickly he damaged it. That means that I've either failed miserably in my designs, or he's gone through a lot more than I could have ever predicted, said Bergen. But he's safe, right? Asked Persia. Bergen turned to her kindly, and patted her on the head. Don't worry. Tegani will come out of this just fine. Delgra walked up to Odivian as he worked on his computer and tapped him on the shoulder. Odivian looked up in curiosity and then spotted the paper that Delgra held out to him. What's this? He asked as he took and studied it. I need you to do me a favor. Since my cover was blown over a year ago, it's been increasingly difficult to get information on certain projects and activities within the government. So I'd like you to go to some of our friends on the inside and call in a few favors. I'm badly in need of information, and they're the best way to get it. Sure, I'll see what I can do. He then turned back to his computer and started working his magic. Delgra cleared his throat. Odivian turned and looked at him curiously. Then, upon seeing Delgra's expression, his eyes narrowed in dismay. You're not actually suggesting that I do this in person, are you? He asked. Delgra nodded. I'm afraid so. I can't risk having this traced back to me. And, if you do it here, it will be. Odivian sighed. All right, fine. I figure it's faster to do this across the web. But if you think it's more secure in person, then I'll go that route. It's not because I believe it'll be more secure. It's just that we're less likely to have it traced back to us this way. And if they find out we're involved, which you know they will, we'll be in trouble in ways I don't care to deal with. Ah, right. So we do this away from the facility to ensure that it decouples any resulting investigation from us. Exactly. The less they can point the finger at us, the better. Odivian laughed. This puzzled Delgra. What's so funny? He asked. I remember we used to do this a lot when we were younger. Delgra chuckled. We still are young, relatively speaking. Odivian laughed. Yeah, relative is the exact word for it. He then closed his laptop and said, all right, I'll work my magic and have this back to you no later than next Tuesday if all goes well. Thanks, I appreciate it. It's no biggie. We both want to win this war, and if it means spooking our own government, then I'm all for it.